Welcome to the Armchair Trader podcast. Today we have Stephen Murphy, co-founder of Prohibition Partners. We're going to be talking about cannabis today, which is a big area of interest for investors at the moment, as we've seen over the last 3 months or so. It's a hot market in the US. It's a hot market in Canada. It's a hot market even here in the UK, as we've seen with some recent listings. So it's a great opportunity to really catch up on what's going on in the sector at the moment. So welcome to the podcast, Stephen.
Perfect. Thank you for having me.
We can see, from the work we've been doing with the Armchair Trader that there's a lot of enthusiasm for cannabis. We're calling it Cannabis 2.0. We were here before when there was a big wave of cannabis stocks coming onto the market. I think it's now 3.5, 4 years ago. Some people at the time said it was a bit of a flash in the pan, but it seems to be coming back again with a vengeance. What's different this time? What's driving the market this time, and what's made it different from the previous sort of wave of hot cannabis investments?
I think probably two main things. The first, I would say, is the quality of companies and quality of management that are there. Early stage, it was young entrepreneurs and maybe inexperienced management teams dealing with everything from international rollouts to capital markets. And secondly, there's a market. There is a market. There is significant sales. Back 4 years ago, the actual addressable market, it was more future looking. And the market that was available for these companies was very limited. So they all talked of, doing sales in Europe or doing sales, in the US or doing sales in Canada. And it would be, the valuations would be based on revenue from year 2 or year 3, opposed to what they're currently trading at. And I think it's matured quite quickly, whereby both the investment community and I would say the management side of the space has grown up quite quickly to be a little bit more realistic on what is happening in the market, but also, to recognize and acknowledge that there has been significant regulatory changes, not just in North America, but around the world in the last 3 or 4 years.
That's certainly something I've noticed is that there are some companies out there that are still getting a lot of love from investors that have been around for a while, and they're obviously the survivors from the previous wave, or indeed they've been around even longer than that. And then you've got new companies coming along. We saw a lot of interest, for example, around Cannabo listing in London. These seem to be less well established, or they have been working behind the scenes, and now they've decided to come to the market.
Yeah, so I think the announcement by the FCA in October of last year, essentially acknowledging or recognizing the demand for cannabis in the UK and in Europe, is being a massive changing point for the European cannabis industry. So one of the key issues that cannabis in Europe has faced, apart from stifling regulation, has been access to capital. And that has slowed down the growth of this industry. Whereas now companies are realizing, one, that they have a path to liquidity, and two, investors are realizing that, that there is opportunities for short-term gains in the space. So what we are seeing is an array of companies that have been on the sidelines for the last 2 or 3 years, who may not have been able to get access to the capital required to execute on their strategy, whereas now there is that opportunity to raise revenue or to raise capital, and do so through listing.
And the regulatory issues, obviously what's making people much more enthusiastic about the sector now than previously. I remember last time around there was a lot of focus on the Canadian industry, and the Canadian industry is still a big player in the overall rollout of CBD and cannabis. But certainly from the North American perspective, there's been a lot of excitement following the election in November, and the expectation that potentially the Democrats and the Biden administration will will liberalize the US cannabis market as well. How significant do you think that's going to be to the overall size of this market and actually helping it to mature?
Look, I think we're still in the very, very early days, especially in the UK when we talk of change in regulations. It's still a very small and limited market where patients have to go through a private closed system, in order to get access to medical cannabis. Unlike other markets in Europe, say Germany, where it is funded by both state and private health insurers, patients in the UK are paying out of their pockets for this. And that is going to stifle growth, substantial growth in this space for a year, for 2 years. Nice, recognize what 50 other countries around the world have recognized in terms of the therapeutic benefits and values of cannabis and medical cannabis. So you have to be somewhat realistic as well. We're not going to see it go from, last year in the UK, to give you some context, there was around 100, maybe 150 patients. This year we will have probably close to 4,000 patients. Yes, it's a substantial growth year on year, and it is following the pattern that we've seen in Australia. But it will take time to build solid numbers here. So what it does is it limits the market size to just a few players. So there's currently only a few players that can really, be profitable and own the existing market. So it pulls, I suppose, investors into limited choices within the space. But, it makes the competition a little bit harder. And certainly the quality of management teams out there are being challenged in this space. So that's one of the positives investors can look at, is because access to capital has been so hard for so long. Now things have changed in the last 3 or 4 months, but prior to that, having access to capital and certainly access to revenue has been a challenge. You've really seen really good management teams shine through. What we are seeing is, now that cannabis has certainly become recognized or accepted and accredited as a legitimate industry and a legitimate career, we're definitely getting a wave of an influx of talent from other industries who, maybe 2 years ago would have turned their nose up at the thought of joining a cannabis company. You're getting talent from the big four, you're getting talent from major tech companies, you're getting talent from the financial district. And that's very, very exciting, because that talent can help, navigate regulations. It can help speed up the market, and it can continue to build investor confidence, which is absolutely essential if the market is going to be unlocked and achieve the scale that we think it can, that it's achieving in North America.
My impression, certainly with the cannabis stocks that we've seen so far, has been that the investor take up has been the more, I would say, adventurous investors getting in early. I mean, some of the stocks, having said that, there seems to be a lot of retail money going into them as well. So it does seem that there is an awareness within a certain segment of the market. But then, as you say, there are a lot of other investors, including larger ones, who are still on the sidelines, maybe because they're still worried about the legality of cannabis, or maybe they're thinking that it doesn't have as big a future as some people say. And talking to some investors, there seems to be a level of uncertainty about just how legal this is, because even a couple of years ago, there was the concerns by some of the stockbrokers about whether or not they were actually allowed to own cannabis stocks in the custody accounts of private investors in the UK. Do you think that the sort of the regulatory situation, I know we've had that clear statement already from the FCA, but do you think that regulatory issue or that legal issue has been a little bit of a brake on the growth of the sector recently?
Oh, without a doubt. There wasn't a conference or a talk that I didn't go to over the last 4 years in London that didn't, talk heavily around POCA. And it's been such a focus point for investors because, they need to tick that box. And, that's, it's taken up so much real estate when it comes to learning about the industry, that the fact that has been, they've been relieved of that level of compliance will certainly have a massive impact. You talk about the first three companies. So we had a session with Cannabis Europa on Tuesday of this week, and we had members from the LSE, we had members from the Aqueous, we had members from Memory or from Hill Dickinson and from Peterhouse Capital. And really, we've been trying to frame the conversation around London is open, but in essence, London has been open since 2018. The Aqueous, or what was then known as the Neo or the Nexus, has had number of companies trading on it. Now, the listings of the three companies in the last 3 weeks on both the LSE and the AIM, the main market, has been really, really, really positive for the industry as a whole in relation to where do I think those three companies sit in the scheme of the industry. It's very early days. Are those the best three companies that are in the sector, etc.? That's not really for me to decide, but I do think it's giving investors the opportunity to invest in cannabis. And there's talks of between both the LSE and the Aqueous this year of between 25 and 30 companies listing. By the end of this year, you will have quite a wide variety of choice for investors who want to deploy capital in the space. What you're seeing is it's not just companies. You mentioned at the start Cannabis 2.0. And I think it's, from an investor angle, it is 2.0. 1.0 investors were all looking and talking about cultivation. We got to be in cultivation. We got to grow. We got to manufacture. Whereas now it's moved on from that. Nobody's talking about how much capacity they have to grow. Cannabis is quickly becoming a commodity from a cultivation perspective, especially as it becomes more globalized, and you're seeing markets like Colombia produce for 10 cents a gram, whereas in Canada it's costing $1.90 for the best cost producer. You're looking at companies that are R&D focused or specifically focused on the delivery mechanisms, or looking at the technology, or looking at the ancillary side of the sector. And that's what will appeal to and bring a wider base of investors into the space, of giving them choice as to what they can invest in. It's been proven that this is a fully compliant and heavily regulated market, so that should give the investor base confidence in that. But the fact that you're getting greater choice as to what you can invest in is going to be a massive bonus for the industry at large.
How significant do you think the ETF market is going to be here? Because we have seen numbers from the ETF industry from guys like Track Insight over the last couple of months have identified some of the best performing ETFs out there right now are those which are focused on, admittedly, North American cannabis stocks, but those kinds of channels could actually bring quite a lot of important new capital into the sector. And I fully anticipate that we'll probably see the same thing happening here eventually, once, as you say, there are enough companies on the market for funds like that to actually be able to get exposure to. Do you see that as a potentially important development? And if you do, what sort of timescale do you think that would be for the UK as well, to see, firstly, active investment manager participation in the market, but then secondly, dedicated cannabis funds or cannabis ETFs investing in the local market?
Yeah, I think it's a massive bonus for the space, and something that is pretty untapped when it comes to the European industry. There is, I think, 3 ETFs focused on Europe, 2 listed, two based in London. The challenge with ETFs in Europe is they were probably ahead of their time. They're still early stage. I think they're all either a year old or just under a year old.
Can you tell us a bit more about the regulatory situation as far as the EU is concerned? Because obviously that's a big market, and I have seen that there has been a little bit of argy-bargy between the French and the European Commission about how the EU is going to go about regulating and liberalising its own cannabis products market. What's the situation with that at the moment? Where do you see that going?
The EU isn't going to do anything. I think that's pretty clear. It's going to be down to the member states as to how they treat and regulate cannabis. Being involved in, going to Brussels pretty much every 6 months for the last few years, and every time it's a brand new set of diplomats and advisors who are there to greet you, and it's the same process of educating them on the system and educating them as to what is happening around the world. There's zero progress made, and zero intent to make progress from an EU perspective. So it is very much down to the member states to actually make their own domestic policy and regulation, and you're seeing that. So for a group like ours that provides strategic consultancy and market intelligence, it's great because we trying to keep on track of what is happening across all member states is quite a struggle for a single company. So we have the ability to map out what's happening in Germany and how Germany is different to Denmark and how Denmark is different to Italy. And, what you are seeing is there are significant differences. There's significant differences in relation to focusing on domestic cultivation, focusing on self-sufficiency, focusing on capital markets, focusing on the relationship between cannabis and the national healthcare system. And it is quite frustrating that the EU hasn't given some guidance on it. I think that may change when the US goes federal, and when you've got this mammoth market that will be dictating terms on international trade. I think that will obviously ruffle feathers in Brussels, but up until now there isn't any advice or suggestions or recommendations or guidance coming from the EU. It's down to each member state in which to implement their own regulation.
And what's their posture like? I mean, I know the Germans have been discussing it recently, and that's obviously a huge market, and one that's been quite open to the idea of innovative health products. So presumably, what you're saying is that someone like Germany, for example, could say, yes, no, we're happy with distribution of CBD, medicinal products, and Bob's your uncle as far as the cannabis sector is concerned.
So I think what you're talking about there is novel foods and the over-the-counter market of CBD. Yes, Europe has made some moves on that in terms of one, recognizing it, and two, the treatment of cannabis, but that hasn't been achieved by the EU's acceptance of cannabis. It has been through their inability to defend their position from legal challenges. That's unfortunately the backward thinking environment that Brussels is in regard to future looking markets. Cannabis isn't unique in its position in terms of the position the EU has taken towards it. You can look at any forward looking or innovative markets the EU has struggled to keep pace with, and that does damage because it slows down lack of access to patients in Europe, and it also gives rise to international competition who can operate, maybe they may be to operate in Europe, but can also do so in other international markets, whereas European companies are going to be much more focused on domestic markets.
And you touched on there also the fact that we're talking here about the use of CBD either as a health product or in the medical profession, and this seems to have been the focus area for many of these first mover companies. One thing that some governments have shied away from is the wider use of, for example, cannabis being made available within foods and things like that. How do you see that playing out? Do you see that being a future area, or do you think that they will keep that more sort of wider recreational access under tight control.
When we try and describe cannabis as under one umbrella, it's pretty difficult. Cannabis has industrial benefits. It can be used in construction. It can be used in electro engineering. It can be used in cosmetics. It can be used as a food ingredient. It can be used in healthcare. It can be used in dermatology. When we try and limit what cannabis can be, or try and put it under an umbrella term, it can be quite challenging. So, to give some context, I think when you talk about food as an infused ingredient, cannabis infused in food and drink, we have seen dramatic change in terms of consumer demand for those type of products, both of the health and wellness side, but in markets where it is legal, in an adult use side as well. You've got different types of products for different types of experiences, and the consumption method and delivery method are very different, and the formats are very different through food and drink. So you have seen an explosion in the drinks market across Europe over the last 3 years. So that is, two things are driving that. One is certainly a move away from alcoholic beverages and alcoholic consumption. And the second is just a natural trend in health and wellness. So a more focus on health and wellness. Are the two correlated? Absolutely. But, they are still massive driving forces for this new consumer demand in cannabis infused drink and food products. Like we're seeing products launch almost on a weekly basis in the UK that are CBD infused or infused with other cannabinoids or flavonoids.
You mentioned the earlier on in this discussion that you envisaged there being a pipeline of more companies in this sector coming onto the market, and it sounds like there are quite a few. Can you say anything more about those, or if you're not able to mention any names, but just the sort of areas we might see new IPOs coming from, sort of subsectors within the cannabis industry?
Yeah, of course. As I said, we're at the 2.0 stage. So there was big news during the week of a European integrated cannabis company called EMAC, based out of London, being acquired by the biggest MSO, a multi-state operator in the US, Curaleaf, for over 280 million. And that makes it one of the biggest transactions, not only this year across all of cannabis, but certainly for a cannabis company to go from origination to 280 million in the course of 3 years in a small emerging market is nothing short of remarkable. So the types of companies that you're seeing more integrated companies. You're seeing some that are pure play consumer packaged goods. And they obviously, for any consumer packaged goods, they need that capital to really open up the market. You are seeing some that are pure tech focused. So don't touch the plant, are purely based on the ancillary side. You're going to see more delivery technology. You're going to see more companies focused on the ancillary side of the industry. So again, don't touch the plant, but provide the services for the space and have the ability to scale their business. Now you're going to continue to get those that touch the plant as well and have access to the plant. So distribution and manufacturing, extraction, and so on, they're all core to the industry, but it comes down to the management team's ability to grow those companies. So for us, I think we're very excited by Europe is going to continue to be either a medical focus, especially when it comes to medical cannabis, or there will be a health and wellness market. Adult use, despite markets like Switzerland, Portugal, the trial that's happening in France, despite these trials and discussions, it's going to take some time before regulations are properly bolted in and you have a thriving market like we've seen, that we see in the US. It takes anywhere between 2 to 3 years before the market catches up with regulatory changes.
Well, thank you very much indeed for that, Stephen. That's been really illuminating, and it does sound to me like there's going to be a much wider menu of companies for investors to look at within sort of 6 to 9 months down the line. Thanks very much indeed for coming on the show this afternoon.
No, look, it's an amazing investment class. There's definitely nothing else like it. And in terms of growth, it's the quickest growing industry in North America. That's going to take root in Europe as well. It's going to take root, in Asia. It's going to take root in Oceania. It's already taking root in Latin America. When we first started covering the space 5 years ago, there was less than 10 countries legal. Today, there's over 50. And that's in a very short period of time. So, in terms of the growth potential of this market, I always say if you try and put cannabis on a growth curve, it's not on the growth curve yet.
You've been listening to the Armchair Trader podcast. To get up-to-date commentary on what's happening in the share markets, both in Europe and North America, and our views on some of the emerging investment stories in the small cap space, make sure you check out www.thearmchairtrader.com and sign up to our free daily newsletter.